We're talking today with Phillip McCabe of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, so Phil, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Cresco, Iowa, back in February 17th in 1946. I was born and raised lived on a farm with my brother and sister, and it was a standard small farm. My dad was a big hog farmer. We raised a lot of hogs, and that's probably the reason I didn't follow into farming. I hated hogs.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I was first kid in my family that went to college and graduated from college. Went to the University of Iowa, got a degree in journalism from Iowa, graduated from Iowa in 1968, and lucky enough it's the middle of the Vietnam War, but lucky enough to land a job coming out of college, because most of the companies I interviewed with said, well, when your draft status is not 1A, talk to us later. But I interviewed in Iowa City with a company called Booth Newspapers, and they own 8 newspapers in Michigan, and they offered me a job in Iowa City without having me show up in the state at all. So I came here, and then in June of '68 started working at the Grand Rapids Press, and in November, about the 1st of November, I got a draft notice, and so I was had to go back and did my physical in Des Moines, and then did my physical in Des Moines.
When you did the physical, what was that like?
It was, I guess I can't say it was embarrassing or anything like that, because I'd been played high school sports, and so you walk around naked around a lot of other guys, but that's a much bigger area, and to walk around in your shorts for half a day or however long that took. Interesting thing about that was that there were 32 of us that day, and I finished first, and I handed my papers to the sergeant sitting behind his desk, and he said, you want to go to the Marines? And I said, I don't suppose I have a hell of a lot of choice, do I? And he looked at my papers, he said, no, you're going to the Army. He said, you can't see good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I was off to the Army. They sent me to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training.
All right, and when did you get there?
I got there about maybe the 10th of December or thereabouts, and we did 2 weeks, so maybe it was a little before that, but they let us go home for Christmas. We got 2 weeks off for Christmas, and that was quite a thing. We did 2 weeks of basic training, did all the stuff you do in basic training, and then they marched us over by groups. We registered for where we wanted to go to get home, and they marched us a few at a time to a big field, had a bunch of buses parked there, and they pointed to a bus, and you got on a bus, and the bus that I was on went to Little Rock, and I changed buses in Little Rock and caught a regular bus from Little Rock to Des Moines, and my wife and mother and father-in-law picked me up in Des Moines. I spent 2 weeks home for Christmas.
Okay, so when had you gotten married?
Got married on my junior year of college,
Okay.
the summer between my junior and senior year was August 26th of 1967,
Mm-hmm.
and where was I? Oh, we
Basically, you got home.
I got home for Christmas, yeah, and saw my wife, and we'd been married about a year, a little over a year. Then we were home for about 2 weeks, plus got through New Year's. A couple of days after New Year's, I went back to Des Moines and got on a bus, and this time the Army didn't organize anything. They had a ticket, and you got a bus that took you, and I got back to Fort Polk. Finished basic training.
So let us back up here a little bit. These days, very few people actually go into the military and haven't been through basic training.
Yeah.
So what actually happens? You show up initially, and what do they do with you?
Well, the first thing is you get a whole bunch of shots. I'm not sure that's absolutely the first thing. Either you get the shots or you get your hair cut.
Mm.
And both are kind of not degrading, the haircut is kind of degrading, but the shots, you're lined up and they give them to you with, I don't know how many shots they had in a gun, and they told you to be sure to lean into that gun, because if you don't, it'll tear your arm in half. And there were guys in front of me who jerked, and they got a big tear, and blood would stream down their arm, so I was sure that I even got my shots. But I think he got like 15 different shots in one injection with this gun. And I said, then there's the haircut, and if you're in the Army, and particularly in basic training, you don't say anything, you just come in and they essentially shave your head.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're issued your uniforms, and then you go and you start the training, which is pretty rigorous. You get up, you're up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and somebody's yelling at you from the time you get up until the time you go to bed. And you're out and you do calisthenics to start the day, and then whatever they've got lined up for you for that day for training, that's what you do. And some days are pretty strenuous because you have a long march to get to somewhere, like the rifle range, and you'll have a few days of rifle training. And the interesting thing on these marches to the rifle range or wherever, each drill sergeant who has a company, he wants to get there first. And so sometimes you end up almost a run to be as you finish out what is supposed to be a march. Some interesting thing in basic training was, for me, was we got to throw one live grenade, and they're really pretty careful about how they get a bunch of kids who have never been around that kind of ordnance. And and you're behind a big wall of wood, railroad ties, I believe, and piled up about so high, and higher than your head, probably 7 feet high. And right in front of that, there's a strip hole in the ground, and it's a sump, and it's about 8 inches wide, and that's for the drill sergeant to kick that grenade if you drop that grenade and pull the pin. And then he jumps on top of you. I didn't have to see that happen, but it was pretty exhilarating to throw that grenade and hear that tremendous explosion after it went over that. You threw it over that, well, there was a big berm behind it, dirt berm behind that wall. And then I had always been a kid with guns, and I hunted as a kid, and so going to the rifle range I kind of enjoyed that. I was a pretty good shot, so, but my eyes weren't good enough, so that I made, what was the top of expert. I didn't make expert, I made the middle rank, I think is marksman. Mm-hmm. But I think it's 400 meters you had to hit something, and I couldn't do that. Anyway, I got out of basic training, and most people got their orders to go to.
To back up again with the basic training, the kind of famous thing about basic training is often sort of just the discipline and the way that the drill instructors treat you and so forth, and or drill sergeants, depending on which branch you're in. How did they treat you?
They made the word trainee sound like the most degrading thing, because by that time they had gotten a little more, they didn't have the term PC by that time, but they couldn't call you scumbag or things like that. But there was so much derision in their voice when they used the word trainee that it was like being called a scumbag. And you got to do a lot of push-ups, and it didn't make any difference what you did. It was always wrong, and so that would incur push-ups. And but we had one guy, and he's a little Puerto Rican guy who came from Gary, Indiana, and he could do 100 push-ups with one hand, and so that didn't make any difference. It was always fun when a new drill corporal would come by or something and give him push-ups, because the regular drill sergeant knew that you weren't going to bother him, but he could knock out, 100 push-ups with one hand. It was just fun to watch that. We had, every morning you'd have to go on a run, and you'd run a mile. That was, and somebody yelling at you all the time that you're not going fast enough and that sort of thing. And then we had to do, before you'd eat a meal, go into the mess hall, there was a bar of overhead ladder, steel bars, and you had to climb that ladder from one end to the other. It's probably 20, 30 feet. It wasn't very long, but a lot of guys couldn't do that. And if you fell off, you end back at the end of the line. So and again, somebody's yelling at you.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you understand why they were doing all that?
Well, not really until we got to the end. I thought, I was older and out of college, and I understood that you had to, get everybody whipped into shape and all that, but I thought it was very petty the way they went about it. But as we got to the end of basic training, the two senior drill sergeants that we had, they were guys who'd been in 20 years. And then they became nice guys. They'd come around, sit around at night and talk about what they were doing, and then they explained that said, when you get in combat, you have to have a group of people who listen and do what they're told instantly. And I said, and then I understood. And so one of these guys I asked him about, I said, as I understand it, I said, you have to take a different approach than the Marines do. And he said, yes, and he said, there's a reason for that. He said the Marines, their approach is to always go forward, and he said, and never have anybody behind them be able to think. They don't want anybody thinking behind them. He said, give me a bunch of kids from the Midwest who are born and raised working outdoors on farms. He said, and they know how to solve problems. He said, I'll take those guys into combat ahead of the guys that the Marines want. And I just thought that was always an interesting response. And the more I watch about big World War II buff, as you know, the more I watch and read about that, that was really a big deal in World War II. The guys to be able to solve problems, and the guys that could take a tank and turn it into something that would put something on the front of it so they could push their way through barbed wire, or push their way through the hedgerows and that sort of thing. So I thought, now I think, gee, I sort of fit into that category, although I wasn't very mechanically, I couldn't have done that sort of thing.
Right, but you could think for yourself. And,
yeah, I was.
You seem to actually want that.
Yeah.
So that was good. Okay, yeah. So that was okay. And so it was the total training experience about 8 weeks minus
it was 8 weeks of 10. The whole time,
yeah.
10 weeks because of 2 weeks off for Christmas.
All right. So now we got to get back to your story. You got to the point where you're finished basic training, and now you get assignments. Where do you go next?
Well, most everybody was going to advanced individual training, AIT. Mm-hmm. I had a degree from Iowa in journalism. So I got my orders, and I was given an MOS, Military Occupational Specialty, of public information, because I couldn't do whatever PIO was supposed to do. And eventually I got to that once I got to Germany, but immediately they sent me to Fort Gordon, Georgia, and assigned me to a public affairs company. And when I got there, I'd already also been assigned an MOS of clerk typist, because I could type 50 words a minute, and anybody who can type, the Army wants those guys. So I got to Fort Gordon, and that was really interesting company, because they had 100 officers and about an equal number of a few more enlisted men than officers. But the reason for that was that those officers were all doing research on countries around the world that we might have to invade, and if we went in and took over that country, then we had to set up the government and operation of those countries, and that's what civil affairs did. And so they were preparing reports that would be filed somewhere in the Army annals, and each one of them, none of them typed their own reports. They had a clerk, and so I didn't get to do that. I was made one of the company clerks. And so there were, I think, 4 guys in the headquarters, and eventually 3 of those guys were either got out of the Army or sent somewhere, and so then I became the head company clerk. And the most interesting experience I had with that was that it was on a Sunday morning, I got called, and my wife was there, and I was living off base, and I got called about 4 o'clock in the morning, said, "Get right in here, we've got something for you to do." And the MPs had arrested Benny Williams. Benny Williams was a drug dealer from New York, and they'd caught him, and they wanted his court-martial papers typed instantly. So that was my most interesting experience in being the company clerk.
So how long did you spend in Georgia?
I was there from February to December, and then I got each month the company would get a levy to send people somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the Vietnam War, almost every month the levy was 10, and 7 people would go to Vietnam, 2 to Germany, 1 to Korea. It was almost always that breakdown. And in December, I was on the levy to go, and I got the levy to go to Germany. And the major I worked for said, "Do you want me to get you off this levy?" And I said, "Hell no." I said, because I'd already been in a year,
Mm-hmm.
and if they sent me to Germany, then I would stay in Germany because I didn't have a critical MOS.
Mm-hmm.
PIO and clerk typists if they could have, by Army rules, you had to have a critical MOS before they could rotate you in less than a year. So I went to Germany, and then that's where I got in the Division Artillery outfit in Germany.
Now, so basically, if you had not gone on that levy, was there a chance you could still have been sent to Vietnam instead?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would they send you to Vietnam if you had less than a year left on your enlistment?
Again, that was a critical MOS thing, as I understood it, because if you were, and of course everybody is, their first MOS is infantry.
Right.
Everybody is infantry. Well, they had plenty of infantry, so if you had something else, if you were, I don't know, what, some armor of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because actually you're getting to that point where the war is getting less popular. I mean, they kept needing more infantry, and more of the draftees
Yes.
wound up going that way. But you go to Germany, you take care of that. Now, what was living in Georgia like? It's the South, where it's nominally desegregated, but...
Well, in 1968, barely desegregated, and I was really taken aback by the blatant racism. The use of the N-word
Mm-hmm.
was just routine, and it was in most of those people, it was something that they didn't think anything about it. They were talking about a black person.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you called them. I said I was particularly taken aback by it. But I did meet a lot of, outside of the racism, and it's hard to put that, a lot of really good people, but,
Yeah.
so that was hard for me to digest it as well.
Yeah. Now, did your unit have any black personnel, or were they all white?
There were a few blacks, and I said the guy that typed the court-martial paper, Benny, was from New York, and he was black. But we had very few, maybe of the 200 people, the officers and men, maybe 15 or so. And all the, I don't remember any black officers. There could well have been 1 or 2, but as far as I know, the blacks were all enlisted people, and they were all, I said, they used that civil affairs unit as kind of a holding unit for if they had to find a place for people coming back from somewhere waiting to get out,
Okay.
or to put somebody before they were going to send them to Vietnam or overseas somewhere. Most of them they were able to turn into clerks, but some of them who came back from, say, Vietnam, they were just they spent their days cleaning up the company area. I mean, they were on KP a lot and doing just biding their time until they could get them out of the service.
Mm-hmm. Did any of them ever talk about being in Vietnam?
Yes. One guy, his name was John Ship, and I enjoyed talking to him because he was an airborne ranger, and he had, in fact, while we were there, in order to keep his jump status, I had to type up the papers he needed to get to be on, not to take leave, but to be,
Get a temporary assignment.
yeah, temporary assignment, that's what, it's TDY is what they called it. And he had to go to Fort Bragg, and then he had to do 2 or 3 jumps to keep his jump status. And the reason for keeping the jump status was that there was pay involved. You made more money if you were a guy who jumped out of an airplane. So.
All right. And did they say anything about Vietnam that it made you any more or less inclined to go there?
No, those stories. Everybody that I talked to had come back from, and they had their stories were. They didn't talk. I don't know that I ever really met anybody who was deep in combat.
Mm-hmm.
I met people who were in a lot of sport outfits in Vietnam. Actually, I didn't really get stories from people who were in the middle of the war in Vietnam until after I was out of the service and back in civilian life. Then I met 2 or 3 guys who had harrowing stories to tell.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of the ones who would be sent to a civil affairs unit might be have an MOS that was something other than combat infantry.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so now you're getting sent off to Germany.
Right.
How did they get you to Germany?
I went to, was transferred through Fort Dix in New Jersey, and I had to report there sometime toward the end of December of 1969. And while I was there, I didn't do much except waited until I got my orders. I pulled KP a couple of times while I was there, huge mess halls there. And again, I was just with people waiting to go somewhere. Well, they were all going to Germany, I guess, because from Fort Dix, that's where you go. But anyway, I flew out of the McGuire Air Force Base on the 31st of December, and I got into Germany just after midnight. It was January 1st, and they marched us into, or took us into a big hangar at Rhein-Main Air Force Base, and they handed out our orders, but when it hit midnight, they lit sparklers, and we had our New Year's celebration in this hangar in Frankfurt, Germany. And I was sent to an artillery battalion, 3rd and 76th Artillery Battalion. It's part of the 3rd Infantry Division Artillery. And I was there for a month. I went to work for a colonel, or lieutenant colonel, who was in command of that battalion. And I was there, and they made me a clerk. I had this PIO MOS, but they didn't have a PIO slot. After about a month, one afternoon, or one day, the Colonel Frank Athanasson and his staff, they came around on an inspection of our battalion, and as he was going through the headquarters, Colonel Fowler, who was a lieutenant colonel that I worked for there, he introduced me to Colonel Athanasson. Colonel Fowler was a lieutenant colonel, and Colonel Athanasson was a full bird. And he said, "This is Specialist McCabe." He said, "I'm not sure why he's assigned here." He said, "He's a public information specialist." He said, "But he said he types well, so we can use him." That afternoon, I had orders to go to work for Colonel Athanasson. He had a PIO slot, and he wanted a PIO. So
how do you spell that colonel's last name?
Athanason. He was very Greek.
Okay.
And a hell of a nice guy. But I'm not sure that the transfer was, part of it I'm sure was that had to deal with, he was after his first star.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he thought that if he had somebody who could write stories and take pictures and that sort of thing, that might help. And so when I was working for him, and I only had to move across base because the 3rd and 76th was on one side of this base. It was in Kitzingen, Germany, and the headquarters for Divardi was on the other side of the base. And so packed up my duffel bag and walked across the base. Anyhow, I went to work for him, and what he and his staff did was pretty much in charge of the training. They had 5 battalions of artillery in the 3rd Infantry Division, and there were 4 battalions that were guns, and the 5th battalion was an Honest John Rocket battalion. And he and his staff would put together war games problems for them, and every time that they tested one of those battalions, I was in his Jeep and we'd go along, and he wanted a story out of that, and so I'd write a story and ship it off through the Army system, and I got stories published in Stars and Stripes and Army Times, and they were stories about what he was doing, and I'd use his name as he was part of, and he had friends from around the world who would clip these articles and mail them to him and underline his name and say, read this about you, that sort of thing, and they'd mail them back to him. And then I really got in his good graces when he said, I want a picture of one of those Honest John rockets coming off the rail. Well, it's a semi-trailer, and they sit on 2 rails behind, and this rocket is, and he said, I've tried for years to get a picture, and he said, all I get is the flaming tail out of half of the rockets out of the frame. He said, if you can get me one of those pictures, he said, I'll be delighted. Well, I did. I got one, and it's perfectly framed, and I went into the lab, and I made him an 11 by 14 blow up, and so he put that on his wall. And so I said, Colonel and I were in good grade, and in this job, I was not on the KP roster.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another good thing. And somewhere in that time, my wife moved over to Germany, and we found an apartment where we moved off base because I didn't have enough rank to live on base in the married housing. And that was a good thing because we had found a little old German landlord, and he had been renting to GIs for years, and he was a really interesting character. He had been a medic in the German army in World War II. He was in Paris when Paris was liberated, and he said the best thing that ever happened to him was he was able to surrender to the Americans, mm-hmm. because every German in the army knew that you'd get the best treatment from the Americans. He said the worst, of course, was to be on the Eastern Front and surrender to the Russians. He said you were dead. He said if you surrendered either to the French or the British, he said life wasn't going to be very good in their camps either. So, but anyway, I said that was a good thing that I wasn't able to live on base because otherwise I never would have gotten to know him. And he told me some other stories about his life. He'd been, apparently was a fairly wealthy family. They lived in Prussia or East Prussia, anyway. But they had to evacuate. They had a plaque on his wall, a wood carving of the family home. It was a very large home, so that led me to believe that they were pretty well-to-do. But they had to evacuate before the Russians moved in, so he got out of there.
Did he speak English, or did you learn German?
We learned enough German to get by, and he was not well educated, so he didn't speak any English other than a few words here and there. But we learned enough German and he told stories in slow enough and not very exact English or exact German. One of the things that was fun, each month I'd go to his apartment, and he had the front apartment in this. He had a home, 2 stories, and he had 2 old maid sisters who lived in the first floor, and then he had one apartment upstairs, and we had the back apartment upstairs, and we saw him every day in passing. But once a month there was this ritual where I'd go into his apartment and pay the rent. And each time he had to pour me some of his homemade schnapps. And he'd pour me about a shot glass, an ounce maybe, and he poured himself a water glass with maybe 8-10 ounces, and he'd just sip it like it was something. But I had to go like this, because it just burned all the way down. It wasn't the schnapps that you'd buy in a store. He had a few notches more powerful.
Yeah, the standard schnapps is 20-some% alcohol or something like that, and this probably was not.
No, this was, I'm not a drinker anyway, and so I don't really like the taste of alcohol, but this actually literally burned as it went down. So,
Now, did you get to travel around a lot or take advantage of being in Europe for that year?
oh yeah, I'd saved all my leave time, and I was already, I was 22 at the time, so I'd been away from home for 4 years, so it wasn't a big deal. Most of the guys who got leave, they would go back to the U.S., and I said, I'm not going to do that. And so we went to Paris, London, Rome, Florence, Amsterdam, and then one of the weeks that I was out with Colonel Thanison on a big field problem, my wife went to Switzerland and looked up some long-lost relatives. Her grandmother had come to the U.S. in 1919, and somehow in the 50s she lost contact with them. But so she went to Basel, Switzerland, armed with some letters and a name, and she found an uncle by the name of August Bachmann, and he was just delighted to meet her, and so he invited us to come and we spent a week with them in Switzerland. He took a week off from work, and he spoke English, which was really a good thing. But the English he spoke was pretty, was very old-style British, because he had been evacuated in World War II. He'd been evacuated to England from Switzerland, and so he learned this English. But there were times when he had a word, and we'd have to stop and figure out what he was talking about. But he organized a family reunion, so that there was one woman left from my wife's grandmother's generation, and that was Tante Lena, Aunt Lena, and so for that they had rented upstairs in this guest house in Basel, and there were about 30 people who showed up, and my wife and Aunt Lena were put next to each other at the head table, and Melinda was particularly, well, not upset, but she wished she'd learned more German, because Aunt Lena didn't speak any English, and so they had to go back and forth. But she had some photographs that from Aunt Lena's generation that she, and so that was a really, really big deal. So that was a really special week that we spent with him. This Uncle August, he had a brother who lived on the side of a mountain, and he lived at, I don't know, 7,000-8,000 feet or something like that on this mountain. And so he took us to the top of his mountain. They had, it was called a Gondelbahn, and they were like a little more than the T-bars that you get at a ski, but it was a little capsule. And we went to the top of his mountain, and we looked then across at the real Alps. I mean, the Grindelwald, Monk and Eiger, the huge mountain, and just to spend a fantastic view of what postcard pictures of Switzerland, really. And but I see we did all that travel. We went to Rome, and went to Vatican, and toured the Sistine Chapel, went to the St. Peter's and saw the Pietà, went to Florence, I saw David, went to Paris, saw the Venus and Mona Lisa, went to Amsterdam, went to the Rijksmuseum and saw the Rembrandt room. So that is where I have a really big interest in art ever since I spent that year in Europe. And so I just love to go to art galleries, and now I do modeling for the art school for Kendall and for Grand Valley, and I really enjoyed learning about art. So the Army did that for me as well.
Okay. Now, you were in sort of specialized units and things and away from people who were, most of them combat veterans, other stuff, but when you were out with the artillery units and things, did you have any sense of what sort of morale was like among the enlisted men?
Those guys were, the ones that I dealt with, they were really, the term we used then was gung-ho.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because they were understood that they were being, I'm not sure about, you know, the new privates, but any of the officers or the NCOs who were involved, they really pushed hard to get these, so they could get the high scores on these tests, and that's, that was fun. Also, I got to go with him to he was in charge of putting on a firepower demonstration for a NATO conference, and I didn't actually get close to the range, but he described how what they had. He had 105 guns that were assigned to him from. He had his own from the third Infantry Division, those guns, but he had another Army division that he got guns from. So, but he said the final shoot was a time on target, and that's all 105 guns were to fire and impact within a couple of at the same time. And he said it's the biggest bang that you've ever heard. He said they had all the way from 8-inch guns, which they could fire 20 miles all the way into the 105s, which had to be within 10 miles or something like that, and then there had 175s and 155s in between that. So he had, and he said now this I was far enough away I could hear the guns shoot, and you'd hear the guns, the 8 inches would shoot first,
Mm-hmm.
and then they would step in, and then they had this 105 shells burst within a second and a half or 2 seconds of each other. He said it really was a huge explosion. So.
All right. So thinking over the time that you spent in Germany, are there other particular things that stand out in your memory?
Yeah, I got to know a guy named Sergeant Ziegler. He was in the headquarters outfit that I worked for, and he was the recruiting NCO, and he was German, and he was a kid in World War. He was a young boy and he was in Königsberg in Prussia.
Mm-hmm.
As the Russians were coming in, and he and his mother and 2 sisters were evacuated. His older sister and his father had to stay behind. They both worked for the government in, I think his father was a postal service, and his sister was the oldest one of his siblings. She was a telephone operator. Anyway, so he and his mother and 2 sisters, they got to Cologne, and they were on one of those ships in the Baltic that didn't get torpedoed,
Mm-hmm.
and so they survived, and they got into a DP camp in
Displaced person.
yes, in near Cologne, and but he always assumed that his father and his sister were captured by the Russians and probably dead. Well, after 6-8 months, his father walked up to them and knocked on the door, found where they were living. His father had walked all the way from Prussia to Cologne, and eventually they rebuilt much of Cologne, and they got up. So they got out of the DP camp and they got an apartment in Cologne. By this time it was the early 50s, and he was about 18 or so, old enough to go to college, and he went to Maritime College in Cologne. While he was there, Red Cross notified him that his sister was alive. And in fact, she was in Germany, and she was married to a U.S. Army officer. And she was somewhere in, I think it was in Munich, but in Bavaria, in southern Germany, and he was way in northern Germany. So he had an address, but had no way to contact her. So he borrowed a motorcycle, and he rode to I believe it was Munich, maybe Heidelberg. But anyhow, he had this address, went and knocked on the door of his sister's apartment, and he said she came to the door, and he hadn't seen her from 44 to 51, 52, whatever this was. And he said she saw him, I saw her. We both broke into tears and threw our arms around each other. We recognized each other instantly. And he said it was at that point, he said it was probably the greatest weekend of his life, he said, because she took him to the commissary and the PX, and he got oranges, he got chocolate, he got cigarettes, all those things that even at that time in Germany, it was very difficult to get good fruit, and particularly he didn't get chocolate. Well, her husband was rotated back to Fort Dix, and so he followed her to this country, and he said he got a job because he now graduated from the Maritime College, and he got a job with United Fruit in New York, and he worked in their shipping division where he would dispatch ships loaded with fruit to go around the world. He'd buy the New York Times every night as he'd go home from work. He had an apartment, he lived alone in New York, and he'd took his German-American dictionary and the New York Times, taught himself English, and he spoke perfect English. I mean, he was that intelligent and that good. But anyway, we became, in the time that I was in Germany.
So had he gotten drafted at some point eventually, or?
Oh no, I'll back up. That weekend that he spent with his sister, he knew that a good place to be was the United States Army, and he wasn't really going very far in this shipping company because he didn't speak English well enough. So he joined the U.S. Army and became a career Army guy. And then by this time, of course, was back in his homeland, and I see he was the recruiting NCO in the company I was in, and we got to be really good friends. And I said, tell him one day about how I just loved German sausage, and he said, "Where do you get your sausage?" I said, "Well, there's a couple of shops there I stopped by." And he said, "Well, I know the guy who runs the best shop in Kitzingen." He said, "I will take you there." And this was really fun. He took me to the shop, and this guy was a pretty good BSer, but this guy was BSing in German, and I couldn't understand much of what was going back and forth. But eventually, the guy who owned this shop, I said, and this was like going to the Baskin Robbins of sausage. He sliced me off something of everything he had in the shop, and I got to take home and try all his. As I was trying, he was pointing out the good ones while I was standing there in the shop and telling me what it was, and so that's for the rest of the time we were there. That's where I bought my sausage. Anyway, got down to the time for me to go home, and Sergeant Sigler said, "Come on," and he said, "I got to do this." He said, "I know you're not going to re-enlist," he said, "but I got to make the pitch." And he made this pitch, and he said, "We'll get you E5 if you want to sign on this dotted line." I said, "No," I said, "I got a job waiting for me."
Okay. So your employer held your job for you? Yeah,
I had worked at the Grand Rapids Press here long enough that the law said they had to hold the job.
Okay.
I came back, and I said everything worked out. We had kids loved the area, and the job worked out, and so we're still here.
And what did you do for the Grand Rapids Press?
I started out as a reporter, and I reported on the city side and worked mostly city commission meetings and small stuff. Then they moved me to sports, and I covered a lot of high school sports, but my beat was at that time that was just 2 years, and that was after I was back from the Army. I covered Grand Valley sports, and the time when Grand Valley was awful and they were just getting started, and the school had only been in existence, I guess 7, 8 years by that time. And if they won a game, it was really something. But I got to know a lot of good people out here in Grand Valley at the time. And then, I see it was in 1973 that I moved to the copy desk, and I was a copy editor for 3 or 4 years. Eventually, I 1978 or so, they promoted me to assistant news editor, and then I sort of half ran things. I was number 2 on the 15-person copy desk. So wrote a lot of headlines and edited people's stories, and that was really an interesting job. I was there for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I was there for the Challenger explosion. I was there for 9/11, and because those things happened, well, I came in one of the dates I remember, May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens blew up, and that happened on a Sunday, but I came in the next morning and that's put together that front page. I put together the front page when we had the mid-morning Challenger blew up in the morning, and we made the big makeover during the day. We went from a routine day to the Challenger explosion. So those were, some of those days were pretty exciting. And every day was really good because every day was different. And every day also ended at the day. I didn't, unlike being a reporter, when you would take things home, you might work on a story for 3-4 days or something like that. Every day putting the paper together was over at the end of the day, and so you didn't take any work home with, mentally take any work home with you, or physically. And,
all right. So when you look back over the time that you spent in the Army, what do you think you learned from that, or how did it affect you?
the best part was the people I met. I had never been out of Iowa until I came to Michigan, and then off to, and then I was thrown in the middle of a bunch of Southerners, and because I went to Fort Polk, I should have gone to either probably Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, but they had I can't remember whether it was hepatitis or something going on at Fort Leonard Wood that they weren't sending anybody there, so that we got, coming from the Midwest, we went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and because of that I met, well, a guy named Chuckaluk, who was an Indian from Oklahoma. I said a lot of Southerners, and the part of the group that came from the Midwest, there were some Italians and Serbs, ethnic group, a lot of ethnic people that I hadn't been exposed to before. And so there was a guy named, an Italian guy named Catazone, who was just, and he was big city. So that was, I was an Iowa farm boy, and so it was just really interesting meeting these people. And then the Southerners, as I said, they were good people, but.
Yeah. And then all the stuff in Germany that you were talking about as well. So pretty good range of experiences there.
Yeah, the guy who ran the photo lab on the base where I did all the work I did, he was German, and he was a professional photographer who had literally traveled around the world, and we talked about, he'd been in the United States, and so there were places in the United States that I had been where he could ask me what I knew about places like that. And he'd done quite a bit of time in Alaska, and then he was, by this time he was in his 50s and had gone home to Germany and got a job with the U.S. Army, kind of pre-retirement job he was. But he said the most interesting thing that he found in America was that, he said, people would literally get in pain waiting to take a leak. He said, because in Germany, he said, if you have to go to urinate, you just stop by the side of the road and you stop and go. He said, you can't do that in the United States. He said that was hard for him to come to grips with that. And I thought that was, of all the things that you'd go to the U.S., that would be the number one thing that you'd come home with. I thought that was a particularly interesting.
All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a pretty good story. So thank you very much for taking the time to share it today.
You're quite welcome. I enjoy that, and it's fun to do this, and I reminisce about this stuff, and it's those memories, 50 years, but they're still very fresh. So.